She was left to face the wrath of an entire town, alone, accused, and condemned. But someone unexpected was watching from the shadows, someone who knew exactly what it felt like to be wrongly blamed. What happened next would defy every rule of their divided world. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The sun beat down mercilessly on the small settlement of Willow Creek in the Texas Territory of 1875. Dust swirled through the air as 20-year-old Margaret Fletcher hurried between the wooden buildings, her threadbare dress clinging to her thin frame. 3 months had passed since her parents' death from typhoid, leaving her alone to face the harsh frontier with nothing but her wits and determination. "You there! Stop right where you are!" The booming voice of Mr. Harrison, the general store owner, cut through the afternoon bustle. His meaty finger pointed accusingly at Margaret as a small crowd began to gather. "I saw you take that bread. Empty your pockets, girl." Margaret's heart pounded in her chest. "Sir, I didn't—" "Don't you lie to me." Harrison grabbed her arm roughly, yanking her forward as Sheriff Daniels approached. "This one's been stealing food for weeks now. Found my inventory short every time she's been around." "I haven't stolen anything," Margaret protested, her voice trembling as curious onlookers formed a circle around them. Among them stood Eleanor Watson, the banker's wife, whose eyes gleamed with vindictive satisfaction. It had been Eleanor who had started the whispers about Margaret after she had refused the advances of Eleanor's brother. "Turn out your pockets," the sheriff demanded, his hand resting on his holster. With shaking hands, Margaret complied, revealing nothing but a small handkerchief and 3 cents, all she had left in the world. But before she could speak again, Eleanor stepped forward, producing a small loaf of bread from her own shawl. "I saw her slip this under her dress," Eleanor declared, her voice dripping with false concern. "Poor thing must be desperate." "That's not true," Margaret cried. But the murmurs of the crowd had already turned against her. Sheriff Daniels sighed heavily. "Margaret Fletcher, I'm placing you under arrest for theft." As the sheriff led her away, Margaret caught sight of a tall, silent figure at the edge of town, a Comanche man on horseback, watching the scene unfold with unreadable dark eyes. Unlike the other Native Americans who occasionally traded at the settlement, he wore his hair in a single braid down his back, and a distinctive scar ran across his left cheek. He met her gaze for a brief moment, before turning his horse and disappearing into the scrubland beyond the town's edge. That night, huddled in the cold jail cell, Margaret heard the whispers of the townspeople outside. They spoke of raids on nearby settlements of the Comanche warriors who still resisted the encroachment of white settlers despite the treaties. The name Silent Wolf was mentioned with both fear and respect, a warrior who had never been captured, who moved like a ghost across the plains, and who, it was said, harbored a deep hatred for the white settlers after his family had been massacred years earlier. Little did Margaret know that by dawn, her life would be irrevocably changed by the very man whose reputation had the entire settlement sleeping with rifles by their beds. As the first light of dawn broke across the horizon, Margaret was startled awake by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Moments later, the jail door burst open, and there stood the Comanche warrior she had seen the previous day, his face impassive as he held the unconscious sheriff by the collar. "You," he said in perfect, though accented English, "are in danger. Here, they plan to make an example of you at first light." He tossed her a set of keys. "Choose now. Stay and face their justice, or come with me." Margaret's hands trembled as she took the keys. "Why would you help me?" The warrior's dark eyes held hers steadily. "I have watched this town for many moons." "You are not a thief, and I know what it means to be falsely accused." He gestured to the open door. "Decide quickly." Outside, a painted horse waited patiently, its breath creating plumes of mist in the cool morning air. The future Margaret had imagined for herself, however difficult it might have been, was disappearing before her eyes. But perhaps this was not an ending, but a beginning. With one last glance at the jail cell that represented the injustice of the world she knew, Margaret made her choice. The rhythm of the horse's gallop had long since melded with Margaret's heartbeat as they traveled deeper into Comanche territory. She clung to the waist of the warrior, who had tersely introduced himself as Taabe, though the settlers knew him as Silent Wolf, her muscles aching from hours in the saddle. The vast Texas landscape rolled endlessly before them, the morning sun casting long shadows across the rugged terrain. "Where are you taking me?" Margaret finally asked, her voice barely audible above the wind. Taabe didn't turn back when he answered. "To my people, what remains of them." As the day progressed, Margaret noticed how Taabe frequently scanned the horizon, his body tensing at distant sounds. They traveled through ravines and shallow streams, doubling back occasionally, tactics, she realized, to confuse any potential pursuers. By late afternoon, they approached a secluded valley nestled between two rocky ridges. Smoke from several fires rose lazily into the air, and Margaret could make out the conical shapes of teepees arranged in a semicircle. Children paused in their play to watch the approaching riders, and women looked up from their work, their expressions guarded. A tense silence fell over the small encampment as Taabe brought the horse to a halt. An elderly man with deeply lined features approached, speaking rapidly in Comanche. Taabe responded calmly, gesturing toward Margaret. She could feel dozens of eyes on her, evaluating, judging. "This is Mukwuru, our elder," Taabe explained to Margaret. "I have told him you were falsely accused, that the same people who broke treaties with us have broken faith with their own." Mukwuru studied Margaret for a long moment before speaking in halting English. "Why bring her here? She is not of our blood." "I saw the truth in her eyes," Taabe replied, "as my sister saw the truth in mine when the soldiers came." The elder's gaze softened slightly at these words, and he nodded once before turning away. Taabe helped Margaret dismount, her legs nearly buckling beneath her after the long ride. "You will stay in my sister's teepee," he said, leading her toward one of the dwellings. "She is gone now, but her memory remains." Inside the teepee, Margaret sank onto a buffalo hide, exhaustion overtaking her. Various items were carefully arranged around the space: beaded moccasins, a parfleche with intricate designs, and a small wooden box painted with symbols she didn't recognize. "Your sister," Margaret ventured. "What happened to her?" Taabe's expression darkened. "3 winters ago, soldiers came to our previous camp while the warriors were hunting. They claimed to be searching for raiders who had attacked a settler wagon. My sister, Numunu, spoke their language. She tried to explain we were peaceful." His voice grew tight. "They shot her as she stood with empty hands." Margaret's breath caught. "I'm so sorry." "She was like you," Taabe continued, his gaze distant. "She believed in truth, in justice." He turned to face Margaret fully. "When I saw the town turn against you, I saw her face again." That night, Margaret lay awake in the unfamiliar surroundings, listening to the night sounds of the camp, soft conversations, the occasional laugh, the whinny of horses. So different from the cacophony of the settlement, yet somehow more honest. The days that followed, Margaret observed the daily rhythms of Comanche life. The women initially kept their distance, watching her with suspicion. Only Queeneye, a young widow about Margaret's age, made any effort to communicate, demonstrating how to prepare food and tan hides. "You work hard," Queeneye commented on the 3rd day as Margaret struggled to scrape a deer hide clean. "Most white women, they think Comanche women are slaves, but we are the strength of the people." "I've always had to work hard," Margaret replied, wiping sweat from her brow. "My father taught me that nothing comes without effort." Queeneye nodded approvingly. "Taabe says you were accused falsely. That white justice is no justice. The woman who accused me wanted me gone because I refused her brother's advances." Margaret's hand stilled. "He thought because I was alone, I would accept any offer." Understanding passed between the women, a shared knowledge of vulnerability that transcended cultural differences. As the sun set that evening, Taabe approached Margaret where she sat outside, gazing at the stars. "Tomorrow," he said, settling beside her, "we will go to the hidden valley. There is something you must see to understand why you are here." Before she could ask what he meant, shouts erupted from the perimeter of the camp. A young warrior rode in at full gallop, calling out in Comanche. The camp erupted into activity. Women gathering children, men reaching for weapons. "What is it?" Margaret asked, fear clutching at her heart. Taabe's face was grim as he pulled her to her feet. "Soldiers, coming from the east." His eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw uncertainty there. "They are saying a white woman was kidnapped by Silent Wolf. They are coming for you, Margaret Fletcher." In that moment, Margaret realized that her fate and that of these people had become inextricably linked. The lie that had driven her from Willow Creek had followed her here, threatening not just her future, but the lives of those who had offered her sanctuary. "What can we do?" she whispered. Taabe's hand closed around her wrist. "Now, we must run." Again. Dawn had barely broken when Taabe led Margaret away from the scattered remains of the camp. The Comanche had dispersed during the night, breaking into smaller family groups that would be harder to track. A survival strategy honed through generations of persecution. "Where is everyone going?" Margaret asked as they rode northwest, the terrain growing increasingly rugged. "To places the bluecoats cannot find," Taabe replied. "Hidden canyons, caves in the high country. We will regroup when it is safe." They traveled in silence for hours, pushing deeper into territory that few white settlers had ever seen. By midday, they entered a narrow passage between towering rock formations, the path so constricted that they had to dismount and lead the horse. "Few know of this place," Taabe explained as the passage opened into a small sheltered valley. A crystal-clear spring bubbled from the base of one cliff, feeding a small stream that meandered through lush grass. "My father showed it to me when I was a boy. He said it was a place of peace, even in times of war." They made camp beside the spring, and as Taabe secured the horse, Margaret noticed a series of pictographs painted on the smooth rock face. Human figures, animals, and symbols whose meanings she could only guess at. "Your ancestors?" she asked, gesturing toward the ancient artwork. Taabe nodded. "And others before them. This place has always been sacred." He traced one figure with his fingertips, a warrior standing apart from the others. "This is why I brought you here. To show you that even in the oldest stories, there were those who stood between worlds." That evening, as they sat beside a small fire, Taabe revealed the story that had brought them together. "When I was a boy, before I earned the name Silent Wolf, my family was attacked by Texas Rangers who claimed we had stolen cattle. My parents and younger brother were killed." His voice remained steady, but Margaret could see the pain etched in the tightness around his eyes. "I was wounded but escaped into the hills. A white settler woman found me half dead from hunger and fever. Instead of turning me in, she hid me in her barn and tended my wounds. She risked everything to save an Indian boy she didn't know." "What happened to her?" Margaret asked softly. "Her husband discovered me and threatened to kill us both. She stood between us and told him that if he believed in the God he preached about on Sundays, he would see that I was just a child." Taabe's gaze met Margaret's. He lowered his gun. "Later, they helped me find my way back to my people." "That's why you helped me," Margaret realized. "You're repaying a debt." "Not repaying," Taabe corrected, continuing. "The woman called me brother before I left, said that kindness should pass from person to person, like a flame lighting new fires." He gestured to the pictographs. "Our oldest stories teach that all humans came from the same source. It is only fear and greed that divide us." As night deepened around them, Margaret found herself sharing her own story. Her parents struggled to establish their small farm, their deaths that left her destitute, and the growing hostility she faced in Willow Creek after rejecting the banker's son. "They didn't see me as a person," she concluded, "just as something to be used or discarded." "Our experiences are not so different," Taabe observed. "My people are seen the same way by most whites, as obstacles to be removed." They fell silent, each contemplating the parallels in their lives. The fire crackled, sending sparks spiraling into the star-filled sky. "Tomorrow," Taabe said finally, "we must decide what comes next. The soldiers will not stop searching." "I can't go back," Margaret said, the certainty in her voice surprising her. Even if I could prove my innocence, I have nothing there. And I cannot take you farther into Comanche territory, Taabe replied. Winter approaches, and my people must move constantly to avoid the bluecoats. It would be a hard life for you. Margaret was about to respond when Taabe suddenly tensed, his hand moving to the knife at his belt. A moment later she heard it too, the distant but unmistakable sound of horses approaching. How did they find us? She whispered, fear clutching at her heart. Taabe quickly extinguished the fire. Not soldiers, he murmured. They would make more noise. These riders are trying to be silent. They retreated to the shadows of the rock wall, watching as 3 mounted figures emerged into the moonlit valley. Even in the dim light, Margaret could make out the distinctive hat of Sheriff Daniels. Beside him rode Eleanor Watson's brother, James, and a third man she didn't recognize, a tracker, judging by his buckskins and the rifle across his saddle. I told you the Indian would head for high ground, the tracker said, his voice carrying in the quiet night. He's holed up somewhere in these canyons. And the girl with him, James demanded. My sister swears she was taken against her will. The sheriff spat on the ground. Your sister's been spinning tales since she was knee-high, and you know it. Margaret Fletcher may be a thief, but she went with that Comanche willingly enough. Either way, she knows too much, James said darkly. About the cattle rustling, about the payments to keep the law looking the other way. If she talks to the federal marshal, Margaret's breath caught. The accusations against her suddenly made terrible sense. She had been framed to silence her, not just because she had rejected James. Beside her, Taabe's expression hardened as he listened to the men planning how to find and eliminate both of them. The tracker was advising they split up to cover more ground, confident they could corner their quarry by morning. We need to move, Taabe whispered. There's another way out of this valley, but it's treacherous in darkness. As they carefully gathered their few possessions, Margaret's mind raced. The truth about the corruption in Willow Creek might be her only leverage, if she could somehow get word to authorities beyond the local sheriff's influence. They led the horse silently along the base of the cliff, staying in the deepest shadows. The men's voices grew fainter as they moved in the opposite direction, confident in their strategy. Just as they reached the hidden passage Taabe had mentioned, a loose stone shifted under Margaret's foot, clattering down the slight incline. The sound, magnified in the quiet night, carried clearly across the valley. Over there, the tracker shouted. A rifle shot cracked through the air, the bullet striking the rock face inches from Margaret's head. Taabe pushed her through the narrow opening, following quickly with the horse. Run, he urged. This path leads to the ridgeline. If we can reach it before dawn, we have a chance. As they fled into the darkness, Margaret realized that the simple choice she had made days ago, to leave Willow Creek with a Comanche warrior, had set in motion events that would demand far more difficult decisions before the sun rose again. The eastern sky had just begun to lighten when Margaret and Taabe reached the ridgeline. Below them, the rugged landscape spread out in all directions, the valley they had fled now a distant hollow among the rocky outcroppings. They had abandoned the horse hours earlier, sending it galloping in the opposite direction as a diversion while they scaled a nearly vertical cliff face that their pursuers couldn't navigate on horseback. Margaret's hands were raw and bleeding from the climb, her muscles screaming in protest, but the urgency of their situation had pushed her beyond what she had thought possible. Now, crouched behind a cluster of boulders, they watched as tiny figures in the distance methodically searched the canyons below. They're persistent, she observed, her voice hoarse from thirst. Taabe passed her a small water skin. The tracker is Blackwood. He has hunted my people for years. He will not give up easily. Margaret took a careful sip, preserving their meager supply. It's not just about me being a supposed thief anymore. You heard them. They're involved in cattle rustling. The banker, the sheriff, all of them. She shook her head. The whole town is built on corruption. This is not surprising, Taabe replied. Many white settlements near our territory steal cattle from Texas ranches, then blame Comanche raiders. His expression darkened. My people are punished for crimes we did not commit. As the sun climbed higher, they moved along the ridge, staying low to avoid being silhouetted against the sky. Taabe explained that they were heading toward Fort Richardson, where a federal marshal was stationed who might listen to Margaret's story. "Why would you risk going to a fort?" Margaret asked. "They'd arrest you on sight." "Not if I don't enter," Taabe said. "But you can." The realization of what he was suggesting hit her. "You want us to separate?" Taabe nodded. "It is the only way. You must tell the marshal what you heard. About the rustling, about the false accusations. With federal authority, he can investigate." He paused, studying her face. "It may be your only chance to clear your name." "And what about you?" "I will return to my people. The scattered bands will be regrouping in the winter grounds to the north." They traveled through the day, descending from the ridge into more forested terrain as they approached areas more frequently traveled by white settlers. By late afternoon, they could see smoke from distant chimneys, and Taabe grew increasingly vigilant, frequently stopping to listen and scan their surroundings. As dusk approached, they came upon an abandoned trapper's cabin nestled in a small clearing. After carefully ensuring it was truly deserted, they decided to shelter there for the night. Inside, the remains of a crude table and bench were the only furniture, but the roof was mostly intact, offering protection from the increasingly cold night air. Taabe built a small fire in the stone hearth, keeping the flames low to minimize visible smoke. As they shared the last of their food, dried meat and a handful of pine nuts, the reality of their imminent parting settled over them. Fort Richardson is half a day's walk from here, Taabe said, tracing a map in the dirt floor. "Follow this creek eastward until you reach the military road." Margaret studied the crude map, committing it to memory. "And if they don't believe me, ask for Marshal Davis. He is known to be fair, even to Indians." Taabe reached into a pouch at his waist and withdrew a small object wrapped in soft leather. "Show him this. It belonged to my sister." Margaret carefully unwrapped the package to reveal a silver medallion on a chain, a military decoration of some kind. "What is this?" "My sister saved a cavalry officer during a flash flood 3 summers ago. He gave her this as thanks." Taabe's voice grew quiet. "It did not save her when the soldiers came, but perhaps it will help you." The gesture, Taabe entrusting her with one of his few remaining connections to his sister, brought tears to Margaret's eyes. "I'll return it to you," she promised. "If it is meant to be," he replied simply. They fell silent, the weight of all they had experienced together in their short acquaintance hanging in the air between them. Margaret realized that this man, whom she had known for less than a week, had become more important to her than anyone since her parents' deaths. "Will I see you again?" she finally asked. Taabe met her gaze steadily. "The path ahead is uncertain, for both of us." Before she could respond, a sound outside the cabin froze them both, the unmistakable click of a rifle being cocked. "We know you're in there, Indian," James Watson's voice rang out. "Send out the girl and maybe we won't burn the cabin down around you." Taabe moved instantly, pulling Margaret away from the doorway. "There must be a back way," he whispered, searching the dark corners of the cabin. Margaret spotted a loose board in the far wall. Together they pried it free, revealing a narrow space between the cabin and the steep hillside behind it. Just enough room for a person to squeeze through. "You go first," Taabe urged. Margaret hesitated. "They're here for both of us." "I will create a diversion," he insisted. "Get to the fort. Tell them what you know." Outside, they could hear the men positioning themselves around the cabin. Time was running out. "Taabe," Margaret began, but he cut her off with a gentle hand on her shoulder. "My sister believed that one act of courage could change many lives," he said. "Now it is your turn to be brave." Margaret knew there was no time for lengthy goodbyes. She clutched the medallion tightly in her palm, then impulsively leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his, a gesture she had seen among the Comanche, a recognition of kinship that transcended words. "Brother," she whispered. A flicker of surprise crossed his face, followed by a rare smile. "Sister," he responded. "Now go." Margaret slipped through the opening, the rough wood scraping her skin as she squeezed into the narrow space. Behind her, she heard Taabe moving furniture, creating the impression that they were barricading themselves inside. She had just cleared the cabin when a shot shattered the window. Pressing herself against the hillside, she began to inch her way along the back of the structure. Suddenly, the front door of the cabin burst open. Taabe's voice rang out, speaking rapidly in Comanche, a war cry that drew the attention of all, their pursuers. In the chaos that followed, Margaret broke cover and ran for the trees, the sound of gunfire and shouting driving her forward. She ran until her lungs burned, following the creek as Taabe had instructed, stopping only when she was certain she wasn't being pursued. As she crouched by the water, catching her breath, she was torn between continuing to the fort and turning back to help Taabe. The rational part of her knew that returning would only result in her capture or worse, but leaving him felt like abandoning the only true ally she had found. In the end, determination won out over fear. Taabe had given her a chance to expose the corruption in Willow Creek, corruption that had harmed not just her, but likely many others, including his people. She would not waste that chance. By dawn, Margaret reached the military road. Her clothes were torn, her face scratched by branches, but the medallion hung securely around her neck. As she approached the fort's gate, she straightened her shoulders and raised her chin. "I need to see Marshal Davis," she told the startled guards. "I have information about criminal activity in Willow Creek, and about a Comanche called Silent Wolf who saved my life." 3 months later, Margaret stood on the porch of the newly established trading post at the eastern edge of Comanche territory. After her testimony had led to the arrest of Sheriff Daniels, James Watson, and several others involved in the cattle rustling operation, Marshal Davis had offered her a position as interpreter and liaison with the local tribes. Her knowledge of basic Comanche phrases, learned during her brief time with Taabe's people, combined with her unique experience, made her valuable to the peace process the federal government was attempting to establish. There had been no word of Taabe since that night at the cabin. The search parties had returned empty-handed, claiming that Silent Wolf had once again lived up to his name, disappearing like a ghost into the wilderness. Margaret chose to believe he had survived, rejoining his scattered people in their winter grounds. As she watched the sunset paint the vast Texas sky in brilliant orange and purple, a lone rider appeared on the horizon. Even at a distance, she recognized the straight posture, the distinctive silhouette. Her heart quickened as the rider approached, stopping at a respectful distance from the trading post. For a long moment, neither moved. Margaret on the porch, Taabe on his horse, the space between them filled with unspoken understanding. Then, almost imperceptibly, he raised his hand in greeting. Margaret mirrored the gesture, the medallion catching the last rays of sunlight as it hung from her neck. No words were necessary. In a world determined to divide them, they had found a connection that transcended boundaries, not as captive and captor, not as white woman and Comanche warrior, but as two people who had recognized in each other a shared humanity. As Taabe turned his horse and rode back toward the setting sun, Margaret knew their paths would cross again. Some bonds once formed could never truly be broken.